Hello everyone, and welcome to Standard Weekly and our look at Dominaria United previews. It's day 2, we got a lot of cards to look at, and there's a lot of good things that I think we'll find playable in Standard. But before we get started, special thanks to our sponsor, Caffeinated Gamers, and for all your support. And now, let's take a look at the cards. Alright, our first card of the day is Shawna Purifying Blade. So Shawna is the leader of the Weatherlight's crew, and this broker's version of the card I think has a chance to see some play if a broker's deck breaks out, because we already have broker's ascendancy, which allows you to put a +1/+1 counter on every creature you have at the end of your turn, and Shawna I think would work well with that, because she has, not only does she have lifelink, but also at the beginning of her end step you can pay X mana, and if you do, you get to draw X cards, where X cannot be greater than the amount of life you gain this turn. So having a few lifelinking creatures, being able to attack, Shawna becomes a card draw engine that I think that deck would really like, because generally speaking, when we see low to the ground decks that want to attack a lot, we typically don't see this kind of card draw ability on them. So Shawna Purifying Blade, I think if we get a broker's deck, I think this is a perfect fit for that deck. Our next card is Asterbearer Blades. So we know going into the next several sets, we're going to see a lot of artifacts and we're going to see a lot of vehicles in that time frame. So right now Aster might not be the perfect card for Standard, but as we move forward through Dominaria United season into the Brothers War and then on to Mirrodin, I think we're going to see a good deck form around Aster. So why is Aster important to us? So when Asterbearer Blades enters the battlefield, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal an equipment or vehicle card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest in the bottom in a random order. So first thing it does, for 4 mana, you're getting a 4/4 legendary human creature that is good on its stats on its own, but also then you get some card filtering. You get to pick an equipment or a vehicle card that you can then cast. And probably more importantly, as we move forward into the next year of Magic, is that Aster changes the equip cost and the vehicle crewing cost of all our vehicles. So equipments now only cost 1 mana to equip an equipment to a creature, and our vehicles only cost 1 mana to crew. So we've already got in Standard good vehicles like Reckoner Bankbuster, which is a 4/4, but currently costs 3 to crew. Well, with Aster on the field, Bankbuster's now 1 to crew. Basically, any creature can crew Bankbuster and turn it into a very quick, very powerful attacking vehicle for your side. So I think we might not see a lot of play early in Standard, but I think there'll be people who try to build a deck around it. But I think what's really going to be good about it is that over the next year, we're going to see sets that are artifact focused, and because of that, at some point, Aster's going to be a very, very good legendary creature for those decks. Our next card is Braids, Arisen Nightmare. Okay, Braids is a character that's been around in Magic's history for a long time, and now we're seeing her first time a card that goes into Standard. So Braids is a legendary nightmare. For a colorless mana and 2 black mana, you get a 3/3 creature with the ability that at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So the nice thing here about Braids is that it gives you a lot of different sacrifice options. Now, yesterday we looked at Liliana and we looked at the Raven Man, which are trying to get cards out of your opponent's hand. Now we've got Braids, who synergizes okay with them as a card, as a creature that can be used to cause you to sacrifice a creature, or you sacrifice an artifact to maybe Oni Anvil, and then your opponent has to do the same thing. And the good thing about this is you get control of what is sacrificed. So if you sacrifice a land, they have to sacrifice a land. If you sacrifice a planeswalker, they have to sacrifice a planeswalker. So there'll be times when you choose to sacrifice an artifact, for example. They don't have any artifacts. So what you're doing is you sacrifice that artifact, they immediately lose 2 life, you gain a card from that, and that pushes your game forward. So I think we're going to have to kind of see how many copies of Braids are going to be needed in the deck, but I can see her fitting into the Liliana, Omnixilus the Adversary deck, and possibly we throw Oni Anvil in there as well, because when you sacrifice an artifact with Oni Anvil on the field, Oni Anvil then creates a 1/1 artifact creature. So if you sacrifice your artifact creature on your turn, then it will in essence replace itself after it's sacrificed. So I can see a nice little synergy between Anvil and Braids that will repeatedly draw you cards and do damage to your opponent. So I think that's kind of the best place I can see so far for Braids in Standard. Our next card is Nimata, Primeval Warden. Okay, this legend is for 2 mana, 2 colorless mana, a black and a green. You get a legendary tree folk with reach. Now, the important thing about this card is, again, the text to it. So a 3/4 for 4 mana with reach is kind of underpowered, but what you get with this card is if a creature an opponent controls would die, it exiles. And when it exiles, you create a 1/1 green Saproling token. So every time your opponent loses a creature, you get a Saproling token. So that's a powerful ability that can very quickly snowball into a board full of little Saproling tokens that you can use to attack down an opponent. This will probably work very well with the Meathook Massacre, which typically is cast for 2 or 3 minus mana to knock out smaller creatures, and you can go underneath Nimata, its toughness, and go ahead and wipe out your opponent's board, or a bunch of the creatures on your opponent's board, and get rewarded with a Saproling token for each of them. There is a Jund deck out there, so I think this is where we're going to likely see this slotted into in connection with the Meathook Massacre or other removal cards that are going to be in the current Standard. Now, also with Nimata, you can sacrifice a Saproling, and Nimata Primeval Warden gets +2/+2 until the end of the turn. So on a turn you want to use Meathook Massacre, and you need to spend more mana to wipe the board of your opponent's creatures, you can actually increase the power and toughness of Nimata to protect it from the Meathook. So I think that's a nice little added ability to help keep Nimata on the field and keep those Saproling tokens being generated. And you can also, for mana and a black mana, you can sacrifice 2 of those Saprolings to draw a card. So I think we'll see this appearing as at least 1 or 2 of in some of our Jund decks as we move forward into Dominaria United Standard. Our next 2 cards are Radas Firebrand and the Golden Argosy. So let's talk about Radas Firebrand first. When I first looked at this card, I was like, it's a 3/1, doesn't have great stats, 2 mana. Yeah, we see a lot of these, or kind of reminds me a little bit of Rimrock Knight that saw some play during Throne of Eldraine season and beyond it in mono red decks. But what Radas Firebrand does that's very important and has proven to be a pretty powerful ability is that when Radas Firebrand attacks, target creature defending player controls with power less than Radas Radas Firebrand's power cannot block this turn. So what you get to do is you prevent one of your opponent's creatures from blocking on a given turn, and you do also have the ability to pump up Radas Firebrand and make it a 5/3. So giving it the ability potentially to prevent the best creature on your opponent's side from being able to block in that attack step. So Radas Firebrand also has Domain, which for five colorless mana and 1 red mana, Radas Firebrand gets a +2/+2 until the end of the turn, and this ability costs 1 less to activate for each basic land type among lands you control. Activate only once per turn. So we can only do it once, and the most it will ever cost is probably 5 mana. Now, again, this is a human warrior. We have seen a number of humans all throughout the preview season, so it might not be improbable that some kind of humans deck forms that's white and green and red. So we might be able to get a 3-color deck going where Radas Firebrand would only cost 3 mana to activate the domain ability, and that would make it something that was very reasonably cost and be a very powerful ability to again take that powerful creature that your opponent has out of the combat step so they can't block against you. Alright, that brings us to our next card, Golden Argosy. So this is a 4 mana legendary artifact vehicle, and whenever Golden Argosy attacks, exile each creature that crewed it this turn, return them to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and it crews for 1. Now, on the surface, a 3/6 for 4 mana that crews for 1 doesn't seem like it's all that powerful, but I think the power in the Golden Argosy is the fact that it exiles each creature that crews it. So you can have more than 1 creature crew it. You only have to have 1, but you can have any number of creatures crew it. They get exiled. So any creature that you have that has an enter the battlefield ability, when it comes back into play at the beginning of the next end step, then you get that activated ability again for that particular creature. So I can see this being, you crew it in defense, you crew it to attack, and you exile 1, 2, 3 creatures with it. They come back to the battlefield. You get the benefit of their triggered abilities, and it again pushes your board state. I'm not sure right now if there's a particular deck that this goes into, but certainly it might be worth a one of in any number of decks that have creatures that have enter the battlefield abilities. Our next cards are Najal the Stormrunner and Sphinx of Clear Skies. So let's start with Najal. Now, on the surface, to me, I look at this. Okay, it's a 5 mana, 2 colorless, 2 blue, 1 red mana for a legendary Efferent Wizard with 5/4. So pretty vanilla generally. But what I really like about the card is when you can cast your sorcery spells as though they had flash. So now you can cast all of your sorceries as instants. And I don't know right now if the Is It Spell deck would want something this large, but I think it's a powerful ability that if we do get a bunch of sorcery spells that you would like to be able to cast at instant speed, then I think Najal might be a good card in that kind of deck. The 5 mana cost is expensive, but I think you can overcome that if you're really benefiting from the ability of this. And what this could be is you're casting spells that normally you can only do on your turn, that have a impact on the board state at the given time that you're casting it on your opponent's turn. And there are definitely some cards in blue and in red that we could definitely see do this. Also with Najal, whenever Najal the Stormrunner attacks, you may pay 2 mana, If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, you get to copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. So again, you can pay 2 with this ability. You can pay 2 mana. You can copy a 4, 5, 6 mana spell with Najal's ability. So I think there's a lot of potential in this card. It'll be interesting to see what deck builders find in terms of a good place for it. It could be a really good card, or people might just look at it and say, I don't think it's worth it to try to build around that. But it would have to be a card you would need to build around. So let's talk about the Sphinx of Clear Skies. This is a 3 colorless mana and 2 blue mana Sphinx creature with flying and ward 2. And it has a domain ability. So whenever Sphinx of Clear Skies deals combat damage to a player, will reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles, put 1 pile into your hand and the other into the graveyard. So at a basic level, Sphinx of the Clear Skies is a 5/5 flying creature. Okay, good stats, good body for 5 mana, and ward 2 to protect it. This is similar to Imarith, the dragon that we got from Adventures in the Forgotten Realm, but this additional ability of card draw could be very important for blue players, because again, we want to keep that card advantage going typically in blue decks, and this is a way to do it, especially if you're using it in a multicolored deck. It has that ability to snowball and draw 2, 3 potentially cards at one given moment. So I think that we're likely to see that, see some play in some of the blue decks. And remember, we do have the triomes from Streets of New Capenna, and with those triomes, each triome is 3 basic land types. So I think meeting the requirement, at a minimum, you're going to be able to look at 3 cards and get 2 cards out of every attack that you attack and damage a player. So pretty good effect overall. Again, that advances your hand and really gives you card advantage in the end. Moving on now to our next cards, we have Vyoshino, Branch Rider, and Vine Shaper Prodigy. Now, these are 2 cards with Kicker. Notice that the Kicker ability on each of them is in a different color. So Vyoshino Branch Rider costs 1 red mana. It's a Vyoshino warrior. It has haste, and when it's kicked for 2 colorless mana and a green mana, if it's kicked, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters when it enters the battlefield. So I think we're going to see a series of Kicker cards that have another color that supports the primary color of the card, that's going to be beneficial to you as a player. So I really actually like, even though these are both common creatures, I really like both of them, because I think they can both fit into decks that want to play multicolor. So some kind of Gruul build. We certainly have Gruul Werewolves that we know is out there, but Gruul Werewolves doesn't really have a 1-drop, but it could go with something like this in that 1-drop spot. And then if you get it later in the game, you have this added bonus of it becoming a 3/3 creature if you kick it. And also Vyoshino Firebrand has that added ability for 3 mana, okay, 2 colorless and a red, where you can pump it up to give it +2/+0 until the end of the turn. So again, you can grow the Firebrand with this secondary ability. And early in the game, typically you'll get in for 1 damage. If you cast it on turn 1, you're going to probably get in for a couple damage in many cases. And then later in the game, you can pump Vyoshino Branch Rider up to become a bigger threat. So let's talk about Vine Shaper Prodigy. So this Kicker ability is 1 colorless and a blue mana. So when Vine Shaper Prodigy enters the battlefield, if it's kicked, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So on Vine Shaper Prodigy, you basically have the ability to do what in essence is a thrill of knowledge, but you don't have to discard cards, and you get to filter the cards you're looking at to see which of those 3 cards are going to fit best into the game state. So I can see, again, just like vyoshino Branch Rider, Vine Shaper Prodigy, later in the game you might cast it for 2 mana on turn 2 to put a creature out on the field, but you draw it later in the game. Almost always you're going to kick it and put a 2/2 on the board and give yourself that advantage of getting another card. So I think these probably fit into some of the decks that we'll see going forward in Standard, especially if we see a blue-green deck form, where we really haven't seen that over the last year or so, but the pieces I think are coming together that we might see a blue-green deck actually have a good chance of coming into existence. Or, as we talked about earlier with Shawna, maybe this fits right into that Broker's deck with Broker's Ascendancy, Shawna, and some other cards that are low to the ground, but we're trying to get big creatures and pump them up as we go. Our next card is Defiler of Vigor. This 5 mana cost, 3 colorless and 2 green mana, Phyrexian Worm with Trample, is a 6/6. We haven't seen very many green cards for 5 mana that are 6/6. We got one last year with Elder Gargaroth, and it saw play throughout Standard seasons. And I would expect Defiler of Vigor to be the top end card in some of our green-based decks, whether it's a mono-green deck, which we know there has been a strong mono-green deck throughout the course of this year, and we're likely to see that deck, need to do some regrouping. But I think we're going to see it at least early in the season. People are going to try to make a mono-green deck work. So Defiler of Vigor also has Trample, and it has a special ability that I think is important to not only green decks, but any deck that has creatures in it that require green mana. So as additional cost to cast green permanent spells, you may pay 2 mana. Those spells cost 1 green mana less to cast if you paid life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of green mana you pay. So what this allows you to do, if you've got a creature that only costs a mandatory of 1 green mana and then a number of colorless mana, which a lot of the green creatures actually do, that I think we're going to see going forward, you have the ability to pay 2 life and reduce the cost of that creature by 1 green mana. So that's going to be a very powerful ability to help push forward green decks as we move forward. And now, what really makes the card, I think, incredibly powerful potentially is that whenever you cast a green permanent, you get to put a 1/1 green counter, 1/1 +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So not only does Defiler of Vigor help to reduce the cost of your creatures, but anytime you put a green permanent on the field, you're growing your team. And there are a lot of cards right now in Standard that have +1/+1 counters on them, or have the ability to get +1 counters, and Defiler of Vigor might be the top end for a deck that wants +1/+1 counters. Alright, let's take a look at the next set of cards. So we got an interesting grouping of cards today in Writhing, Necromass, Molten Monstrosity, and Tolarian Terror. They all cost a lot of mana. Okay, Writhing Necromass, 6 colorless mana and a black. Molten Monstrosity, 7 mana and a red. Tolarian Terror, 6 mana and a blue. But what all of them have is a special casting ability where it's going to reduce the cost of these spells for you. So certainly these are going to be limited playable, without a doubt. And I think some of them might just have enough, even though they're very expensive, to see standard play because of the size of the creatures. They're all 5/5s, and they all carry an ability with them. Writhing Necromass has Death Touch. Molten Monstrosity has Trample. Red loves to have Trample. Not a lot of red cards have Trample, so having a Hellion with Trample is a great ability for red decks to have. Dominaria Terror has Ward too, so it's going to make it much harder for an opponent to target it with spot removal. But what makes these cards very playable in my mind is that each of them can reduce the casting cost based on their particular ability. So Writhing Necromass, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. So you've got this card, you may play 1 or 2 of it in your deck, but as creatures on your side die over the course of the game, they're actually reducing the cost of Writhing Necromancy as you see cards go to the graveyard. And we've seen a number of cards from not only Dominaria United but from other sets that would like to see you in black sacrifice things. So if you've got this in your deck, you can build a graveyard presence by sacrificing creatures over the course of the game, and you can potentially even bring Writhing Necromass down to the cost of 1 mana. Molten Monstrosity. Okay, this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Typically, the top end cards we're going to see in red are going to be at least 4 power, possibly more. With Thundering Raju, you're dealing counters out. You might be able to get 5 or 6 depending on where you are. So again, Molten Monstrosity can be very easily reduced to a 3 or 4 mana costing card. So you're getting a creature that has better power than the cost of it. And finally, we have, again, with Dominaria Terror, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. Is it spells? Lots of instants and sorceries. Very easy to reduce the cost of Dominaria Terror to 2 or 3 mana, if not even less, getting it all the way down to 1. So I think there's a potential for all of these cards to see some standard play in a deck that's built around the mana reduction ability that each of them has. And the nice thing about all of them is that they're common. And I'm pointing this out in particular because during Throne of Eldraine season, we had a card called Embercleave that the cost of Embercleave was reduced by the number of attacking creatures you had. And typically, I would cast an Embercleave for 2 mana because I would attack with enough creatures to reduce it to 2, just to the 2 required red mana that it would cost. And the same thing was true for this whole series of artifacts from Eldraine, that if you met the requirements, it would reduce the mana cost. And they saw play throughout the 2 years that Throne of Eldraine was legal and standard. So I think these have a chance of seeing some play, but we'll have to see what kind of decks they fit into well. Alright, for our last card of the day, we have a new black removal card, Cut Down. And oh baby, this is one that I'm looking at and I can see our friend Raffine going down by. Okay, typically when we see 1 cost removal spells, it is a 1 or 2 mana creature that you can kill with it. But Cut Down gets to destroy a target creature with a total power and toughness of 5 or less. Raffine, even though it has Ward, is actually its converted mana cost, or converted power and toughness when it enters the battlefield, is only 5. So this is going to be a card that I think we're going to see all over black decks throughout the next 2 years, because it's going to knock out 1 mana cards, 2 mana cards, 3 mana cards with no problem, and sometimes even 4 mana cards that are like Halana and Elena, who is a 2/3 creature with special abilities that we saw from Innistrad, that has seen play throughout the last year in Standard as a +1/+1 counter machine to grow creatures. So I think Cut Down is just a pretty cool addition to the black removal package, and I can't wait to get it in some black decks and cut down some creatures that people aren't thinking would get removed at a low cost of only 1 mana. Alright, that's our spoilers for today. So a lot of good cards, I feel like, that will find their way into Standard decks. We'll see some spoilers over this weekend trickle in. You might get another video over the weekend to look at those cards, or we may wait until Monday night to get our next Dominaria United preview video out. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Thanks to our sponsor, Caffeinated Gamers. And I'll see you next time.